A maid with nimble hands, and a secret sewn deep into her stitches. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Let's grow this mystery-loving community. Comment where you're watching from. I read everyone with curiosity and joy. Let's begin. It was in the first chill week of November, when the fog hung low upon the Thames like a damp curtain and the gas lamps of Baker Street flickered pale against the encroaching gloom, that I, Dr. John Watson, was stirred from my usual morning reading by the sharp rapping of a gloved hand upon our door. Holmes, who had been lounging in his armchair with the Persian slipper beside him, took no notice. His gaze remained fixed on the ceiling with that peculiar intensity he reserved for mental rehearsal. I rose to admit our visitor, expecting perhaps another of those trifling inquiries which so often cluttered Holmes's Morning Post, only to find Mrs. Hudson handing me a pale blue envelope with the Wayford family crest etched in silver. "A footman brought it, doctor. Said it were urgent." Holmes's fingers twitched as I broke the seal and unfolded the enclosed sheet, written in a precise feminine hand. 221B Baker Street, November 6th. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You will forgive my directness. A matter of the gravest urgency compels me to seek your expertise. A young maid in our employ, one Miss Agnes Finch, was discovered dead this morning under circumstances most unnatural. While the constabulary believes it to be an unfortunate accident, I am convinced there is something more, something hidden. I implore you to come to Wayford House at your earliest convenience. My husband, Lord Wayford, is presently abroad, and I am quite alone in managing the household. Please consider this an appeal not only to your profession, but to your sense of justice. With sincerity, Lady Helen Wayford Holmes, whose interest had evidently been piqued by the silence that followed my reading, now reached forward with a long, pale hand. "May I?" he asked, though the gesture itself served as permission. He examined the paper carefully, holding it up to the window light and sniffing faintly. Lady Helen writes with urgency, but not panic. A woman of control, yet under pressure. Observe, Watson, the faint indentation here, just above the date. She began the letter last night and then stopped. Whatever occurred this morning compelled her to resume. Curious, is it not, that she makes no mention of the maid's condition or precise cause of death? She implies foul play, certainly. Indeed. But note her use of something hidden, and the phrase under unnatural circumstances is an artful one. Let us suppose, then, that the death was outwardly mundane. A fall, perhaps, or a mistake with gas or laudanum. Yet some detail unsettles her. In such foggy ambiguity, Watson, lies the scent I find most invigorating. Holmes stood and reached for his overcoat with sudden resolve. "Shall we catch the 10:05 to Marylebone and hire a cab to Mayfair? If we are swift, we shall reach Wayford House by noon, just in time to witness the remains of breakfast gossip and before the servants begin modifying their recollections. You think the household will lie? I think they will shape their truth to protect themselves or others. And if this Agnes Finch truly sewed a secret, as your title so melodramatically suggests, then we must unpick each stitch before it's concealed forever." We departed into the grey November morning, the hansom cab rattling through a city that seemed half asleep under its quilt of soot and steam. Holmes sat beside me, fingers steepled, lost in that abstract realm where facts were shadows and speculation a kind of dance. When we arrived at Wayford House, an elegant 4-story townhouse nestled behind wrought iron gates, we were met by the butler, a gaunt man named Malkin, whose eyebrows arched nearly to his temples. "Her ladyship awaits you in the blue salon," he intoned. "Inspector Dallard has already visited and departed." Holmes exchanged a glance with me but said nothing. We followed the butler into a room that smelled of dried lavender and furniture polish, where Lady Helen Wayford rose from a chaise. She was a tall woman with striking silver hair, no more than 40, and eyes the colour of ash under snow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," "Thank you for coming. You have our deepest condolences, Lady Wayford," I said gently. She inclined her head. "It is not grief alone that moves me, Doctor. It is doubt. They say Agnes fell, tumbled down the back stair and broke her neck, but she was not a girl given to clumsiness. And it is the sewing box." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Do tell." "Agnes was a seamstress by training. She did minor mending for the household, though she was a parlour maid by title. She kept a small tin box with her needles and threads. I found it open on her nightstand this morning, empty but for a scrap of cloth, stitched shut. She reached into her pocket and produced a swatch of cream muslin, neatly hemmed, no larger than a handkerchief. Along one edge, a single line of thread sealed the fabric closed, as though it hid a fold or cavity within. Holmes took it with the reverence of a man accepting an ancient artifact. No attempt to open it. I could not bring myself to do so. It seemed personal, and I feared what it might mean. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then it is good that you summoned one who thrives on what others fear to see." He held the fabric to the light, examining the stitching, then pulled a small penknife from his pocket and severed the threads. From within the muslin, a curl of paper emerged, folded tight, no larger than a postage stamp. Holmes opened it with care. There, in smudged graphite, were 5 words. "He watches from the pantry." The room seemed to constrict around us as silence settled. Holmes exhaled, almost in satisfaction. "Well, Watson, it appears our ghost wears an apron." And thus began the curious affair of Agnes Finch, the maid who sewed a secret and stitched her own death into the seams of silence. Holmes turned the note between his fingers as if it were a rare artifact. He held it to the light again, observing the faint creases, the pressure of the pencil strokes, the fold marks worn at the corners. I watched him, familiar with the particular silence that meant his mind was racing far ahead of the rest of us. Lady Wayford, composed yet clearly anxious, sat rigid, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. "Lady Wayford," Holmes said at last, "tell me precisely who discovered the body, at what time, and what their movements were prior." "It was Mrs. Hackett, our cook. She comes up the back stairs every morning at 6:30 to collect the silver tray from the upper corridor. Agnes usually leaves it outside my dressing room after collecting it from the salon. This morning the tray was there, but Agnes was not. When she went to the servants' quarters, Mrs. Hackett found her at the foot of the back staircase. Her neck had snapped. Inspector Dallard concluded she missed a step and fell." "And what was your impression?" Holmes asked. Lady Wayford hesitated. The girl's shoes were neatly placed beside her bed. Her apron was folded and set on the counterpane. That's what unsettled me. She was always meticulous about routine. If she had already begun the day's duties, she would have had her apron on. "She dressed, left the room and returned," Holmes murmured. "Something drew her back. The note, perhaps." Lady Wayford nodded. "Or something she'd hidden and meant to retrieve. The box was ajar. The muslin was inside." Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson, let us see the scene while the air is still undisturbed." Lady Wayford stood. "I will take you there myself. The staff is in the kitchen. Malkin keeps them busy to avoid gossiping." I did not wish the house to feel altered. She led us through a long hallway lined with oil paintings, each depicting stern-faced Wayfords of previous centuries. We ascended the back staircase, narrower and far plainer than the grand central stairs, and emerged into the servants' wing. The air here was cooler and scented faintly of starch and coal dust. At the far end of the passage stood a small door, unpainted and worn around the handle. This was her room, Lady Wayford said softly, and stepped aside. Holmes entered first. The chamber was modest, scarcely large enough to contain the narrow bed, the plain wardrobe, and the washstand. A small window, partly fogged, overlooked the mews. The sewing tin lay open on the nightstand, with nothing inside but a stray needle and the indentation where thread spools had sat. Holmes moved without speaking, his gaze absorbing the entire space with that uncanny precision he so often displayed. He knelt beside the bed, studying the apron, then glanced toward the door. "No sign of a struggle," he muttered. "Nothing. Displaced. And yet—" He stood abruptly and crossed to the window. Peering out, he drew a slow breath. "Watson, note this. The roof of the pantry below. See it?" I joined him. Beneath us was the narrow slate rooftop of the household pantry. Just beyond it, a side alley ran between the house and a brick wall that divided the Wayford property from its neighbor. The alley ended in an iron gate, currently latched. Holmes tapped the window glass. "The eaves are dusted in soot. A man walking across them would leave a trail, yet there is none. So, no exit that way. Let us examine the staircase." We returned to the back stair. It descended steeply to the basement corridor, where the scullery and pantry lay. The final 4 steps were worn at the edge, but not dangerously so. Holmes descended them slowly, testing each with the tip of his cane. Then he crouched beside the 3rd step and plucked something from beneath the trim. "A thread," he announced. "Grey cotton, frayed. Not from her uniform." "Lady Wayford, what color were Miss Finch's dresses?" "Blue, always blue serge." "Then this came from someone else. Likely from a coat hem or trouser cuff. We are no longer looking at a simple fall, I think." At the base of the stairs, a small wooden door opened into the pantry, a low-ceilinged room lined with cupboards and stone shelves. Holmes stepped in, eyes sweeping the space. He crouched again, this time beside the far wall. "There," he murmured, gesturing. I looked closer. A series of faint scuff marks scratched the dust near the wall, barely visible. Holmes removed his glove and pressed his hand to the wall. With a slight push, the panel gave a fraction of an inch before springing back into place. "Hollow," he said, "and hinged. Concealed storage, perhaps, or a passage." Lady Wayford stepped in behind us, now visibly pale. "I had no idea that was there." "It is often the oldest houses that contain the deepest secrets," Holmes said. He removed a small blade from his coat and inserted it gently into the seam. With a delicate twist, the panel creaked inward. Behind it, a shallow recess emerged, just deep enough to conceal a person crouching. Dust and cobwebs clung to the edges, but the interior was clean. Recent. Holmes leaned in and sniffed the air. "Stale tobacco? Cheap. A man was here recently. Likely last night." He rose and turned to Lady Wayford. "Your household staff. How many men?" She counted silently. 3. Malkin, the butler, Hargreaves, the footman, and Jacob, the kitchen porter. "Any visitors last evening? Tradesmen? Guests?" "No, none. I dined alone." Holmes nodded. "Then the man in the wall was already in your household. Perhaps still is." He stepped back into the corridor and closed the panel. "We must speak to them all, in order. But first—" He turned to me with that gleam in his eye I had come to know so well. "Watson, I believe the time has come for us to meet the pantry." "The pantry?" "The note, Watson. He watches from the pantry. And now we find a concealed recess behind that very wall. A man hid there, likely listening, possibly watching. But whom?" We made our way to the kitchen. The clatter of pots and dull hum of conversation halted as we entered. A plump woman in a flour-dusted apron looked up. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we've no bread ready yet." Lady Wayford raised her hand. "Mrs. Hackett, these gentlemen are here regarding Agnes Finch." A hush fell over the kitchen. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I require only a few moments with each of your staff. In private, if you please." Malkin entered, his expression taut. "Shall I arrange a room?" "Thank you, Mr. Malkin," said Holmes. The library, perhaps. Over the next hour, Holmes spoke with each member of the staff, calmly, precisely, noting every twitch of the eye and hesitation of speech. Most were tearful, confused, or genuinely blank. But when Jacob, the kitchen porter, entered, I noticed Holmes lean forward a fraction. Jacob was young, thin, with sleeves too short and eyes too shifty. His fingernails were black at the edges, and he smelled faintly of coal dust and something else, an acrid scent I couldn't quite place. "Tell me, Jacob," Holmes said almost lazily, "did you see Miss Finch last evening?" "No, sir, not after supper." "She went up." "Did she seem upset? Anxious?" Jacob shrugged. "Didn't talk to me much, always kept to herself." Holmes paused. "Do you smoke?" "Me? No, sir." "Odd. I'd wager you prefer Capstan Navy cut. Am I mistaken?" Jacob's face turned red. "No, sir. I mean, I had one now and then, but not regular." "I see." Holmes stood. "That will be all for now." When Jacob had gone, I turned to Holmes. "Capstan, is that what you smelled?" "Yes. And the faint scent on his cuffs matches the stale tobacco in the pantry." He lied, Watson. He was in that space, or near enough to leave a trace. But whether he merely hid or saw the girl fall, well, that remains to be seen. He held up the folded note again. "He watches from the pantry." A warning, or a confession. And now we have a man who denies the habit that betrays him. Jacob may not have killed her, but he certainly knows who did. And with that, Holmes returned the muslin scrap to his pocket, the expression on his face not satisfaction, but anticipation. The game, I knew then, had truly begun. Holmes said nothing more until we were back in the hallway. The library door closed behind Jacob with a muted click, and the air hung with the faint smell of old bindings and dust-polished wood. Outside, the gas lamps were already flickering to life in the creeping dusk, their light barely breaking the shadows that collected in the corners of the room like secrets of their own. I watched Holmes pace slowly in front of the hearth, one hand behind his, back, the other toying with the muslin scrap as though it were a cipher still to be solved. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, but firm. "Jacob lied, poorly. He's been in that concealed pantry recess. But fear, not guilt, dictated his silence." "You believe he saw something?" "I believe he heard something first, perhaps saw something after. Whether he understands what he saw is another matter." "What will you do with him?" "Nothing for now. The truth is not yet ripe. If we press too early, we may spoil its flavor." At that moment, Lady Wayford entered. She was still pale, though her composure remained striking. Her glance flicked between us. I heard the last of them leave. "Have you made any progress?" Holmes turned to her, that faint half-smile returning to his lips. "I rarely mistake motion for progress, Lady Wayford, but we are certainly stirring the sediment. I shall require access to Agnes Finch's belongings, letters, keepsakes, anything that may be found in her wardrobe or drawer. And I would like to see the back gate, the one off the alley behind the house. Of course, Malkin will show you both." But Holmes held up a finger. "Not yet. First, I must see your sewing room." She blinked. "The sewing room? But that's not where Agnes worked." "No, but it is where your household's fabric stores are kept, I presume?" "Threads, bolts of cloth, discarded garments." "Yes, but I fail to see the relevance. I believe our maid's secret was stitched with more than words. Come, Doctor." We followed her to a room off the second floor, narrow, well-lit, and lined with cupboards and shelves. A Singer sewing machine sat near the window. Scissors hung from hooks beside spools of thread and ribbon arranged by color. Holmes moved with quick, almost feline precision. He ran his fingers across the spools until he found the gray cotton that matched the thread from the stair. He examined it closely, then held it beside the seam in the muslin scrap. Satisfied, he nodded. "She used this spool to stitch the message shut, but observe here." He pulled open a lower drawer. "Several offcuts of muslin, One is missing from this stack. See how the corner is jagged? Lady Wayford looked down, startled. I hadn't noticed. Few would, but Agnes did not use a scrap at random. She selected it from here. Now ask yourself, why sew a message shut rather than simply write it? She was hiding it from someone. Someone in the house. Holmes gave a faint hum of approval. Yes, and doing so with intent. She had time. She folded the cloth, stitched it neatly, and placed it in the tin, her most private space. That is not panic. It is deliberation. I stepped forward. But what did she mean by it? He watches from the pantry. Was she being literal? Holmes straightened. I suspect both less and more. The pantry was not only a hiding place, it was a vantage point. But we must ask, who would be the object of that watching? What did Agnes know, or what did she come to suspect? At that moment, a quiet knock came at the door. Malkin stood there, stiff as ever. My lady, pardon the interruption. There is a gentleman downstairs, a Mr. Basil Harrow. Lady Wayford's face changed subtly. Mr. Harrow is my husband's solicitor. I didn't expect him today. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Watson, shall we see what brings the solicitor to our doorstep on the day of a maid's death? We descended to the front parlor, where Mr. Basil Harrow stood in his overcoat, still gloved and holding his bowler hat in one hand. He was a thin man in his middle years, with spectacles perched on a long nose and an air of perfumed calculation about him. Lady Wayford, he said, bowing. I was in Mayfair on other business and thought to stop in. I heard about the girl's accident. Most regrettable. Indeed, Lady Wayford said. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson are assisting me in understanding it more clearly. Harrow offered a polite nod. Of course. Most esteemed gentlemen, if there is anything I can provide. Holmes took a step forward, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Mr. Harrow, he said smoothly, as solicitor to Lord Wayford, I presume you are familiar with the household accounts? I am, though I don't manage them directly. There is a steward for that. Still, Holmes continued, you would be aware if any unusual bequests were drawn up recently. Changes in Lord Wayford's will, alterations involving staff. Harrow stiffened slightly, but answered with professional calm. Not to my knowledge. There were discussions last spring about updating certain provisions, but nothing concrete was ever filed. Why do you ask? I ask, Holmes replied, because Agnes Finch was hiding something, and secrets often trail money like a fox to scent. The solicitor gave a tight smile. With respect, Mr. Holmes, Agnes Finch was a maid. It is unlikely she was party to such matters. Holmes's voice was mild, but I caught the sharpened edge beneath it. You'd be surprised what maids overhear when gentlemen forget they are present, or believe them unimportant. Lady Wayford stepped forward. Mr. Harrow, I think we must ask plainly. Was Agnes Finch ever mentioned in any private matter? Any correspondence between yourself and my husband? Harrow opened his mouth, hesitated, then shook his head. Number, I swear it. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on him for a moment longer before he gave a polite incline of his head. Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrow, and your candor. As the solicitor took his leave, Holmes turned to Lady Wayford. May I trouble you for one final item this evening? I should like to speak to Agnes Finch's closest friend among the staff, someone who might understand her habits. That would be Nellie Dray. She's the scullery, maid. They arrived together last year, shared a fondness for embroidery, I believe. Have her sent to the drawing room in 15 minutes, and instruct her, if you would, that she is not in trouble. When Nellie arrived, flushed, anxious, and wringing her apron, Holmes greeted her gently, motioning her to a chair. Nellie, he said, I know this is difficult, but I believe Agnes may have left us something important, a clue to something she feared. Did she ever speak to you of anyone troubling her? Nellie's eyes welled immediately. No, sir. Agnes was quiet, always polite. But She'd been scared these past few weeks. Jumpier. I asked her once if someone had said something to her, and she said, Holmes leaned forward. She said what? She said, he's always watching. Just like that. I thought she meant the butler or Jacob. He looks too long sometimes, but then last Sunday she gave me her thimble, her best one, said if anything ever happened to her, I was to keep it. Holmes's eyes lit with sudden fire. The thimble. Do you have it? Nellie nodded and retrieved it from her apron pocket. It was brass, well used, with a tiny engraving on the band. Holmes turned it over in his hands. Then he took his lens from his pocket and examined the inside. Ah. He looked up at me with that electric glint I'd come to dread and admire. What is it? I asked. She was clever, our Miss Finch. Look here, Watson. Inside the thimble, etched so faintly it required the lens to discern, was a date, 15th of October, 3 weeks prior. Holmes stood. She knew. Not just that someone was watching, but something had already happened. Something worth engraving into metal, hidden in plain sight. I stared at the thimble. What happened on the 15th? That, said Holmes, is what we shall learn next, and I suspect the pantry is not the only place in this house where someone's been listening from the shadows. Holmes turned the brass thimble over once more, the etched date glinting faintly beneath the lens as though it were a whisper caught in metal. He handed it back to Nellie Dray with a gentleness that surprised even me. Keep this close, Miss Dray, he said. You've done your friend a service today. Nellie blinked quickly, nodded, and left the drawing room in silence, her fingers clenched tightly around the token as though it might warm her against the memory of what had happened. I watched the door close behind her before turning back to Holmes. The 15th of October, what do you make of it? He had already returned to pacing, the rhythm of his strides marking the tempo of thought. That date is no mere whim. It marks an event of significance, something that jolted Agnes from the realm of fear into the realm of preparation. It was the moment she realized her danger was not imagined. The moment she knew someone was watching her, not merely with contempt, but with intent. I moved toward the window, drawing the curtain slightly to peer out. A drizzle had begun, barely audible against the glass. Then the question becomes, what happened here on that day? Holmes turned to Lady Wayford, who stood near the fireplace with her arms folded across her bodice. Tell me, he said, do you keep household records? Logs of deliveries, visitors, absences among the staff? She nodded. Yes, the steward keeps a daily ledger. It's filed in the butler's study. Then I shall require access to it. I wish to see the entry for October the 15th. Lady Wayford hesitated a moment, then left the room without a word. Holmes waited, hands clasped behind his back, and I could see he was already drawing lines between invisible points, arranging facts that had not yet declared themselves as such. When she returned, she held a leather-bound volume, worn at the corners, with pages of cramped script dated and signed. Holmes took it and sat on the edge of the writing desk, flipping through until he reached the appropriate date. He read aloud, slowly. October 15th. Morning fog delayed delivery of linens. Afternoon guest, Mr. Julian Calder, arrived 3:15 p.m., departed 4:45 p.m., wine cellar inspection requested by Lady Wayford. Porter Jacob dispatched to assist. No staff absences. He looked up, eyes glittering. Julian Calder. Lady Wayford nodded, uneasily. A friend of my husband's. He's been abroad for several years. His visit was unexpected. He said he had business in town. Did he speak with any of the staff? He greeted Malkin in the hall, but otherwise I don't believe so. Holmes tapped the entry. Then why does his arrival coincide so precisely with the date engraved inside a maid's thimble? She said nothing. I stepped forward. Who is Calder, really? What does he mean to the household? Lady Wayford was still a moment too long. Then, with a voice carefully measured, she said, Mr. Calder and my husband were once close, university friends. They've had disagreements, but I don't know the details. Basil Harrow might. Holmes was already standing. Then we shall call upon Mr. Harrow this evening. But first, Jacob. What of him? I asked. He was in the wine cellar that afternoon, alone, or so we thought, but perhaps not unobserved. I wished to know what he saw, or what he was told to forget. It took little effort to have Jacob summoned again. He entered with the same hunched gait and nervous twitch about the mouth, though I noted he avoided Holmes's eyes this time. Holmes gestured to a chair, his tone conversational. "Jacob, remind me. On the 15th of last month, you helped inspect the wine cellar. With Lady Wayford?" Jacob blinked, then nodded quickly. Yes, sir." "Was anyone else present?" "No, sir. Just me and her ladyship." Holmes' voice remained soft. "You're quite sure?" "Think carefully." "Did anyone come or go?" Jacob's eyes darted. "There was someone upstairs, maybe, but not in the cellar." Holmes did not press. Instead, he held out a coin between his fingers, a sovereign. Jacob stared. "I do not ask for gossip," Holmes said quietly. "Only a single memory. Did you see Mr. Calder in the cellar?" Jacob's throat bobbed. "No, sir. I heard voices. That's all. I was in the far end, stacking crates. I didn't see nothing, but I heard—" "Yes." Jacob lowered his voice, arguing, not loud, but cold, like one of them was angry without shouting, and a woman crying. Holmes' gaze did not shift. "A woman?" Jacob nodded. "Not loud. Just like she was holding it in. I thought it was her ladyship. I didn't say nothing after. I didn't want trouble." "You believe Agnes was there?" "I don't know, sir. I didn't know she'd gone down, but next day she looked different, like she'd seen something she couldn't forget." Holmes gave him the coin. "You've been most helpful, Jacob." Jacob stared at it as though unsure whether to pocket it or bury it. Then he left, and Holmes turned to me with a breath of finality. "She saw them," he said. "You believe she was in the cellar that day. She need not have been seen herself. Perhaps she passed through quietly, heard more than intended. Perhaps she recognized a voice, and recognized what the tone meant. Something happened in that cellar. Not criminal, perhaps, but damaging. Something she thought she should tell, or threatened to tell. I considered it." "You think Mr. Calder was threatening Lady Wayford?" Holmes shook his head. "Number, that is too simple. But consider, a man returns from years abroad and meets privately with a woman in her own home. A servant overhears it. Days later, that servant begins to withdraw, hides a message, then dies." He moved to the fire, staring into it as though the flames might shape themselves into answers. "Agnes may have seen something Calder did not want seen. Or, worse still, she may have been involved with him directly. I must speak with Harrow." Outside, the fog had thickened into a cold mist that clung to our coats and made the lamps glow like halos as we arrived at Basil Harrow's office on Brook Street. A clerk admitted us without question, and moments later we were in the solicitor's study. Harrow looked up, surprised but composed. "Back again, Mr. Holmes. I trust you've come to some conclusion." Holmes moved forward. "Mr. Harrow, I will be brief. What was Julian Calder's business with the Wayfords? And do not insult us by suggesting it was a casual visit." Harrow's jaw tightened. "I am bound by client confidentiality." "You are bound by the law," Holmes replied, "but not from preventing a greater crime. A woman is dead. You may not see how the two events connect, but I do." Harrow leaned back in his chair. "There was no crime. Not from Mr. Calder, nor Lady Wayford. That remains to be seen." A long pause stretched between them. Then Harrow said, "Very well. But if this becomes public, I shall deny it." Holmes inclined his head. "I expected no less." Harrow folded his hands. Calder returned from Egypt 6 weeks ago. He claims to have found a letter, one written by Lord Wayford years ago, a confession of sorts. It implicates him in financial misconduct tied to the Bank of Alexandria. Calder says he retained the letter as leverage. He claims it could destroy the Wayford name. I stiffened. Blackmail. Extortion, Harrow agreed, but difficult to prove. He came to Wayford House to negotiate privately. I don't know what passed between them, only that Lady Wayford insisted it was handled. Holmes's voice was suddenly grave. And she made no mention of a third party? No. Then I fear she failed to realize one was listening. He turned to me. Come, Watson. We are running out of darkness. Tomorrow morning I shall speak with Lady Wayford again, but not as a guest, as an interrogator. The streets of London swallowed us once more, the mist rising thicker with every step, as the maid who sewed a secret seemed to whisper again in my ear. Not with words, but with the question she could never ask aloud. Who else was listening that day? And what did they decide to do about it? Dawn broke reluctantly over London, smothered beneath a ceiling of low grey clouds that pressed down upon the rooftops and dulled the lamplight to a lifeless smear. Holmes and I arrived once again at Wayford House by 8:30, the streets still glistening from the rain that had fallen during the night. A butler I did not recognize admitted us this time. Malkin, it seemed, had taken ill, and Holmes noted the substitution with the quiet lift of a brow. Lady Wayford awaited us in the morning room, where the remnants of a solitary breakfast tray lay untouched on a table beside the hearth. Her posture was still stately, but her features bore the tautness of someone who had slept only in fragments. She wore grey again, subdued, formal, as though bracing herself for cross-examination. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "you've returned quickly." "I am a believer in momentum, Lady Wayford," Holmes replied, unbuttoning his coat. "When a truth stirs beneath the surface, it is best drawn up before it retreats." She gestured to the chairs. "Please, have you discovered something?" "I believe Miss Agnes Finch overheard something on the 15th of October, Holmes began without preamble. "She was not meant to. She kept it hidden for a time, but something prompted her to fear discovery. That fear escalated. And then she died." Lady Wayford's lips parted slightly, but she did not interrupt. Holmes continued. "You said Julian Calder's visit was unexpected. That is not entirely true. He may not have written ahead, but you knew he would return eventually. And when he arrived, he brought with him a letter, a damaging document implicating your husband in financial impropriety. This you did not disclose." Her silence deepened. "The cellar," Holmes said. "That was the location you chose, because it was private, removed, but you did not account for Agnes. She may have entered to return a bottle or simply out of routine, but she heard something. She may have even seen him." At last, Lady Wayford's voice returned, low but clear. "I knew she was nervous afterward. I asked her if she was unwell. She said she was tired." "You did not press?" I thought it best not to. I was trying to shield this house from scandal, from collapse." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes dark and intent. "Shield it from collapse, or shield your husband." "My husband is not here," she said sharply. "Nor is he guilty of what Calder claims. That letter, even if real, proves nothing. Calder wanted to frighten me into compliance." "And did he succeed?" "No," she said, and there was iron behind it. "He offered to sell me the letter, to spare the Wayford name, if I paid him a sum and agreed to write a statement confirming his trustworthiness should he be investigated by any colonial authority. I refused." Holmes stood and crossed to the window. The fog beyond had begun to lift in tendrils, curling like smoke. Miss Finch must have heard part of this exchange. Enough, perhaps, to understand that secrets were being bartered behind closed doors, but I believe it was something she saw later that confirmed her peril. He turned to face her. "Did Calder remain after you told him to leave?" Lady Wayford's brow furrowed. Number he left that evening. I remember distinctly. I watched his carriage go. Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. Then something else occurred, either that night or soon after. Something that made Agnes go from fearful to certain. He walked slowly to the hearth, where the remains of the morning fire still glowed faintly. "Tell me, Lady Wayford, was anything stolen from the house recently? Something small? Something you might not have even reported?" She blinked, then slowly nodded. "A brooch. From my dressing table. An old piece. Not valuable. I assumed it had been mislaid. Describe it." "Gold filigree. A rose pattern. It was missing the clasp." Holmes turned to me at once. "Watson, do you recall the shape pressed into the muslin scrap, the faint ridge line beneath the fold?" I did. Yes, it looked like something had been enclosed. Small. Flat. Precisely. Not a coin, as I thought. "A brooch," Lady Wayford straightened. "Are you saying Agnes took it?" "I'm saying she found it. Perhaps it dropped during Calder's visit, or perhaps it was planted later. Either way, she kept it. Not as a thief, but as a message. She believed it mattered." Holmes stepped forward again. More, swiftly now. "Where is her uniform?" "The one she wore the night before she died." "In the laundry, I expect." "Then we must go there now." Within moments, we were descending into the servants' basement again. The laundress, a soft-spoken woman named Bridie, showed us to the baskets. Most of the garments had already been pressed and returned to the maid's pegs, but Holmes insisted on examining each. He found it in the third basket, a blue serge dress, folded with care. He unfolded it quickly, examined the collar, the cuffs, then stopped. There. Inside the bodice lining, just above the hem, a single pocket had been sewn by hand. Sloppily, but recent. Holmes drew a small blade and opened the seam with care. The brooch tumbled into his palm. It was as Lady Wayford described, gold, petal-shaped, worn smooth around the edges. Holmes turned it over. There, on the underside, barely legible, were two initials scratched in clumsy cursive. "J.C. Julian Calder," I whispered. Holmes nodded, holding it up to the light. "She had it," he said softly. "She knew. She hid it in her dress, stitched it in secret. Perhaps she thought she could use it. Perhaps she thought someone would believe her." I took a step back. Then the question becomes, who knew she had it? Holmes looked at me, and for the first time since we began, his voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone in this house." We returned to the morning room, Lady Wayford trailing behind us with quiet horror written across her face. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. He stood at the fire and stared into the brooch, turning it between his fingers like a coin being weighed. "Lady Wayford," he said finally, "does Mr. Calder have a key to this house?" She flinched just slightly. "He used to, years ago." "Did he ever retrieve it?" "No." Holmes looked at me. "Watson, I want you to do something for me." "Of course." "I want you to take this brooch and walk out the front door. Make sure the servants see you. Say you're going to have it appraised. Let the name Julian Calder pass your lips. Then walk 2 blocks, wait 10 minutes, and return by the rear alley. Quietly." "Why?" "Because someone is going to try to stop you." And he said no more. I slipped the brooch into a small velvet pouch Holmes handed me and pocketed it carefully. The weight of the thing felt greater than gold, more like a fuse newly lit. Holmes, now every inch the watchful hawk, gave me the briefest of nods as I made my way to the front hall. Lady Wayford had vanished again into her private rooms, and the new butler, young, heavy-set, a replacement for Malkin, glanced at me with a faint narrowing of the eyes as I reached for my coat. "I'll be out for a short while," I said, drawing the pouch just into view as I slipped it into my coat's inner breast pocket. Mr. Holmes has asked me to take this to an appraiser. There's a mark on the back. Initials. We suspect it may belong to Julian Calder." I said it loudly enough for the footman arranging umbrellas to hear. The butler's expression remained fixed, but his eyes followed me all the way to the door. The November air outside had turned sharp and metallic, and the sky hung like a leaden lid over Mayfair. I walked briskly, heading westward, making sure my pace was neither hurried nor leisurely, enough to be seen, but not to invite suspicion. I passed two hansoms, a boy hawking morning papers, and an old woman selling roasted chestnuts before I turned into a quieter lane near Cavendish Square. There, under the sloping arch of a carriage house, I stopped, leaned against the brick wall, and waited. 10 minutes passed. 11. Then 12. Just as I turned to begin the return journey through the rear alley, I heard it. Footsteps, quick and deliberate, coming down the lane behind me. I remained still. A man turned the corner, a narrow-faced figure in a brown cap and wool coat, sleeves rolled up slightly to reveal soot-stained wrists. It was Jacob, the kitchen porter. He hadn't seen me yet. He paused at the entrance to the carriage house and scanned the street. His mouth twitched. Then, with clear hesitation, he stepped around the corner and disappeared into the mews. I followed, silently. He moved swiftly now, his boots clapping against the cobbles until he reached a black iron gate leading to the rear of Wayford House. He slipped through it without hesitation. I hung back and counted to 20 before circling round and entering by the same route. Holmes was waiting for me at the edge of the garden, half shadowed by the angle of the conservatory. "Jacob," I whispered. He followed me. Holmes gave a quiet sound of satisfaction. "Good. Then he's frightened, but not of us." We crept toward the servants' entrance. Through the pantry window, we could see Jacob inside, hunched over the counter, breathless, looking at something in his hand. It was the pouch. Number A, twin to it, empty. Holmes leaned toward the window and rapped once, sharp, sudden. Jacob jolted so violently that the pouch fell from his hand. He scrambled to pick it up, his face stark with panic, then looked toward the door, unsure whether to run or beg. Holmes stepped inside. I followed close behind. Jacob backed into the corner near the shelves. "I didn't take it. I swear it. Please, I only—" "Only what?" Holmes asked, his voice as quiet as a blade unsheathing. "Followed a man in the fog to rob him? Or were you trying to return the brooch to someone who told you it had to disappear?" Jacob's throat worked helplessly. "I didn't hurt her. I never touched her." "You didn't need to," Holmes said. "You were the errand boy, weren't you? A watcher, a messenger. Tell me, Jacob, was it Julian Calder who paid you, or someone already inside this house?" Jacob opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Agnes saw something, Holmes went on, closing the distance now. She heard the argument in the cellar. Maybe she recognized Calder. Maybe she followed him upstairs, but then she found the brooch. She kept it, and someone knew. Jacob's hands curled at his sides. "You were sent to search her things," Holmes said. "But you didn't find it, did you? You panicked. That's why you returned last night. That's why you watched from the pantry. And when she came back into the room, you were there." No, I wasn't." Jacob's voice cracked. Holmes crouched slightly, his voice low, persuasive. "Then help us, Jacob. Tell us who gave the order." Jacob hesitated. "Was it Calder?" A pause. "No." Holmes blinked. "Then who?" Jacob's eyes filled. "I was told she was going to ruin the house, that she was making things up, that she was dangerous, that if I saw her doing anything strange, I should report it." "By whom?" Holmes asked again, softly now. Jacob swallowed. "Malkin." We both froze. Holmes straightened slowly. "The butler." Jacob nodded, tears threatening to spill. "He said she was writing things down, that she might give them to a reporter, that if I could find any letters, he'd take them to the solicitor, but I never found anything." Just the tin. I thought if I got the brooch it would stop everything. And last night? I asked. Did you see her fall? Jacob's voice broke. I was in the pantry. I swear I didn't touch her. I heard a sound, her voice like she'd seen something, then a thump. I ran out and she was there, crumpled. It was too late. Holmes exhaled slowly. Did you see anyone else? Jacob shook his head. Just the stairs. She was coming back down, but she wasn't alone. Who else? I don't know. Just footsteps above her. Heavy, then nothing. Holmes was still for a long moment. Then he turned and strode swiftly toward the corridor, motioning for me to follow. Malkin, he muttered, the one man with keys to every lock, knowledge of every schedule, and no need to account for his presence anywhere. But he's unwell. He hasn't been seen since yesterday. Exactly. We reached the servants' wing, where the butler's quarters were located. Lady Wayford, alerted by a maid's hurried whisper, joined us just as Holmes reached the door. It's locked, she said, frowning. That's not usual. Holmes produced a thin length of steel from his coat pocket and made short work of the latch. The door creaked open. The room was empty. The bed was unmade. The trunk at the foot had been flung open in haste. Several drawers gaped like pulled teeth. A broken teacup lay in the fireplace. On the dresser was a folded slip of paper. Holmes stepped forward and unfolded it, eyes scanning the page. Then he handed it to me. The note read, "Forgive me." I thought it was only loyalty. I thought I was preserving, something worth preserving, but it's all rot. She died because I waited too long. It was unsigned. Holmes moved to the wardrobe and pulled it open. Inside hung a long overcoat, black wool, with a faint smear of grey soot along the left cuff. Holmes spoke at last. He was in the pantry. And now? Now he's gone? We stood in silence as the truth settled over the room like settling dust. The brooch, the thimble, the muslin, each stitch a warning unheeded. Agnes had known, and now we knew too. We left Malkin's room in silence, the note still fresh in Holmes's hand, its words echoing louder than any shouted confession. Lady Wayford walked beside us down the corridor, her face drained of all remaining colour. The weight of truth, it seemed, had finally begun to settle upon the house, not with drama or collapse, but with the slow inevitability of a ceiling sagging inward after years of hidden rot. He served this house for 18 years, she murmured. I never suspected. Not once. Loyalty, Holmes said absently, can be the most dangerous motive of all. More blinding than greed, more enduring than guilt. We reached the drawing room, where the fire had dwindled into a ring of faintly glowing embers. Holmes seated himself with a sudden weariness, folding the butler's note into his coat pocket, as though locking away a final piece of evidence. I stood by the window, peering out into the garden where the frost still clung to the edges of the grass like ash. We should alert Scotland Yard, I said at last. Of course, Holmes replied, but not yet. Not until I know why. Isn't it enough? Lady Wayford asked, her voice hoarse. He hid the brooch. He searched her room. He knew she'd overheard something. He panicked. You said it yourself. Holmes shook his head, slowly, deliberately. Number that is the story Malkin tells himself. That's the narrative he constructed to rationalize his actions. Waiting too long, acting too late. But Agnes Finch did not fall because of a man's delay. She died because someone acted. Someone else. Lady Wayford stared at him. You think there's another? I'm certain of it. I felt a chill ripple across my shoulders. But Malkin's note is a diversion, Holmes said sharply. A desperate attempt to shoulder blame before the truth catches him from behind. He believes he failed to protect the house. That's why he fled. Not because he pushed her, but because he feared what else would be uncovered. Then who? I asked. Holmes stood. We begin where all betrayals begin, at the intersection of knowledge and power. Someone knew Agnes had the brooch. Someone knew she had sewn the muslin shut. Someone knew she had been seen returning to her room, and someone waited at the top of that staircase. He turned to Lady Wayford. You told me only 3 men served in this house. Malkin, Jacob, and Hargreaves, the footman. Yes. But we have accounted for Malkin and Jacob. That leaves Hargreaves. Where was he the night Agnes died? She blinked, then frowned. He was off duty. His sister was ill in Lambeth. He left at 5, returned after breakfast the next morning. Confirmed? By Malcolm. Of course. Holmes did not need to finish the sentence. Of course, now Malkin's word carried the weight of fog. He had stood sentinel over the household schedule, and now the very ledger he managed had become suspect. I want to speak to Hargreaves, Holmes said. Lady Wayford rang the bell herself this time. The new butler appeared moments later, and at her instruction, vanished to fetch the footman. The man who arrived was tall, clean-cut, and alarmingly expressionless. He had the bearing of someone used to silence and eyes that avoided Holmes's without seeming evasive, more like someone looking just behind you, always. You were in Lambeth the night Miss Finch died? Holmes asked at once. Yes, sir. My sister lives off Walworth Road. She's been ill with inflammation in the chest. Anyone in the house who can confirm this? My brother-in-law, and the doctor who visited. Do you have any correspondence from her? A letter came yesterday. I can show it to you. Holmes considered him. No need, for now. I stepped forward. Did you know Miss Finch well? Hargreaves turned his gaze to me. No, sir. We had no occasion to speak often. Different duties. Did you notice any change in her behavior in recent weeks? Not particularly. She was quiet, diligent. Holmes remained still. Did she ever speak to you about the pantry? The pantry. Yes. Did she ever say anything about someone watching her? No, sir. Did you ever spend time in the pantry? Hargreaves blinked. Only to fetch items for the parlour or drawing room. Holmes studied him for another 10 seconds, then said, That will be all for now. The footman bowed and left. Lady Wayford turned at once. You suspect him? No, Holmes said. I suspect him of nothing, because he suspects me. Did you see how carefully he answered? Each reply was precisely shaped, no more, no less. That is the behavior of a man with something to protect. I frowned. You think he's involved? I think he knows more than he told us. But if he was away, Holmes paced, then either someone forged the entry in the household ledger, or someone else wore his shoes. I blinked. You mean? Yes, Watson. I mean the most elementary form of disguise. A livery coat and gloves can make any man into a footman from behind. And in a house with a dozen rooms and a dozen distractions, who would notice? Lady Wayford sat slowly. But why impersonate a servant? To move freely, Holmes said. To appear invisible. To approach Agnes without alarm. Only someone clever, calculating, and desperate would try such a thing. He turned abruptly to me. We must return to Harrow. The solicitor? Yes. I need to ask him a question, not about the law, but about records. An hour later, we were seated once more in Basil Harrow's panelled study. The solicitor looked warier this time. The brooch had made its rounds, and the truth, or parts of it, had begun to bleed through the city's polite circles like ink through linen. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Harrow, did Lord Wayford ever authorize a power of attorney for Julian Calder? Harrow looked startled. Number never. Why? Because someone accessed the house's internal documents, someone familiar with both your role and the staff's rhythms. I believe Calder attempted to gain control of something far greater than reputation, something he could sell. You think he wanted to inherit? I think he wanted leverage. And when Agnes found the brooch, she threatened that plan. But if he was acting alone, Holmes held up a hand. He wasn't. He had help. Someone who could impersonate a member of staff. Someone who could alter a ledger. Someone who wanted this house's silence as much as he wanted its name. Harrow's eyes widened. Then the impersonator. Wasn't Hargreaves, Holmes finished. It was Calder himself. The silence in the room thickened. He knew the staff. He had a key. Malkin saw him, but thought it was the footman. That's why Malkin blamed himself. He wasn't protecting Calder. He didn't know. I looked at Holmes. Then Calder killed Agnes. No, Holmes said quietly. He pushed her, but I believe he meant only to frighten her. He didn't expect the stairs to betray him, and when she died, the one piece of evidence, the brooch, went missing. So he stayed. He searched. He watched. I whispered, "He's still in the house." Holmes nodded. "And now," he said, "we invite him to tea." The sun had begun to slip beneath the rooftops by the time we returned to Wayford House, casting the drawing room in the kind of golden dimness that disguises more than it reveals. Holmes refused the offer of tea himself, but insisted it be served at 4 sharp in the blue salon, Lady Wayford's preferred chamber for receiving guests. The room, with its pale walls and heavy velvet drapes, was intimate without being confining, private without being secretive. It was, in Holmes's words, the perfect stage. I watched from the far corner as preparations were made. Lady Wayford, now fully briefed, kept her expression carefully neutral. Her manner was poised, but there was a faint tremble in her hands as she selected the teacups. Whether it was from fear or revulsion, I could not yet say. Holmes took a seat beside the hearth, boots crossed at the ankles, his steepled fingers resting lightly against his chin. He appeared, as ever, the image of indifference. Only the sharpness of his eyes betrayed the anticipation beneath his stillness. "Send word," he told the footman. "Tell Mr. Calder that Lady Wayford wishes to see him once more before he departs London. Tell him it is a matter of reconciliation." The footman hesitated. "But Mr. Calder left, sir. He hasn't—" Holmes cut in without raising his voice. "Tell him he will come." The young man paled slightly and withdrew. Lady Wayford looked to Holmes. "You're certain he never left?" "He never intended to," Holmes said. Calder's escape was never a sudden affair. It was a game of nerves. He thought he had time. Time to retrieve the brooch. Time to conceal his trail. When he saw it had vanished, and that the investigation was turning inward, he chose the one place he could remain invisible. "Here. You think he's still inside my home?" "I think he's never been more than a corridor away." We waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The footman returned, his complexion several shades lighter than when he departed. "He's here, my lady. Mr. Calder has arrived." "Show him in," Holmes said. Julian Calder entered with the kind of grace one expects from men too certain of their own importance. His suit was immaculate, his cravat faintly perfumed, and his hair perfectly parted as though not a day had passed since his last salon visit. And yet something in his face betrayed him, a slight dryness at the corners of the eyes. The subtle tension of a jaw kept purposefully relaxed. "Lady Wayford," he said with an elegant nod, "may I say how relieved I am to hear from you? I regret that our last meeting ended so abruptly." Lady Wayford did not rise from her chair, and I regret that it began under false pretenses. He gave a quiet chuckle, then turned to Holmes. "I presume I have you to thank for your persuasive involvement in all this?" Holmes inclined his head, cool and unreadable. "Merely an observer, Mr. Calder. I take no sides." Calder smiled faintly and took the offered seat, crossing one leg over the other. "Then perhaps you'll permit me to clear the air. I admit I may have presented my concerns too aggressively, but my intentions were not malicious. A letter came into my possession, an unfortunate relic from years ago. I believed Lord Wayford would prefer it remain private." "A curious way to describe blackmail," Holmes said, not looking up. "Blackmail," Calder echoed lightly. I assure you, no money changed hands. Only intent. Lady Wayford leaned forward. You came here under the guise of diplomacy, but then you stayed. You watched. You waited. Why? Calder blinked. I don't understand. You never left after the day Agnes Finch died, Holmes said, rising at last. You wore a footman's coat. You altered the ledger. You searched her room, and you followed Dr. Watson when you believed he had taken the brooch. Your performance was admirable. Down to the last thread. But the brooch eluded you. Calder's smile began to slip. Holmes stepped forward. You confronted her that night. Perhaps she saw you first, recognized you in disguise. Perhaps she ran. Perhaps you only meant to frighten her. But the stairs were narrow, the angle steep, a single push, deliberate or not, and gravity did the rest. Calder stood abruptly. That's absurd. You have no proof. Don't I? Holmes turned to the sideboard and picked up the small velvet pouch I'd carried earlier. You followed this, he said, holding it up. You followed it into the fog. You ordered Jacob to retrieve it for you when he failed. You sent Malkin searching when you could not. And then you waited. Until now. He dropped the pouch onto the table with a soft thud. Calder didn't move. His hands were still at his sides, but his chest had begun to rise and fall more quickly. I've committed no crime, he said through his teeth. Holmes tilted his head. Then you won't object to Scotland Yard examining your belongings? Or your room at the tavern you never actually stayed in? Or perhaps the servants' quarters, where I believe your missing coat, dyed, altered, and now badly worn, still lies folded beneath the floorboards? Calder's eyes narrowed. You have no warrant. Holmes stepped closer. But you have no alibi. The silence that followed was exquisite. Calder took one slow breath, then another. I'll speak only with my solicitor, he said at last. You may do so at Scotland Yard, Holmes replied. Lady Wayford rose now, her voice clear. You used this house to shield your ambitions. You used my trust. You used my silence. Calder met her eyes, and for a flicker of a second, I thought I saw regret, or perhaps just the last flickering of a flame snuffed too soon. Then he turned, hands raised slightly, as two constables Holmes had summoned in advance stepped into the room. As they led him out, Holmes returned to the hearth, his face calm but unreadable. He stared down into the embers, the final ashes of a long and careful puzzle. I moved beside him. How did you know he'd come? Because men like Calder cannot bear unfinished performances, he said. He needed to control the final scene. He believed he could still manipulate Lady Wayford. That's why he stayed, and that's why he lost. I nodded slowly. And Agnes? Holmes sighed. She tried to speak. The brooch, the muslin, the thimble, each an attempt to leave behind a thread of meaning, but in the end, it was fear that sealed her lips. Do you think she would have gone to the police? Holmes paused. No, he said finally. I think she believed the house would protect itself, that it would choose decency over discretion. He turned to Lady Wayford. Perhaps now it finally has. We left shortly after. As we stepped into the evening chill of Baker Street later that night, Holmes paused beside the window of our sitting room, looking out into the darkened street below. He drew a long breath. Watson, do you know what strikes me most about this case? No. That for all our questions, the maid who sewed a secret left us the most eloquent answer of all. He held out the muslin scrap again. Its seam now opened, but the threads still loose where her hand had once closed them. She didn't write a confession. She didn't accuse. She simply warned, and in doing so, gave us enough to find the truth. I watched the fabric flicker in the firelight, a pale whisper of memory. Then may she rest, I said softly, and may no secret like hers go unheard again. Holmes said nothing, but he did not let go of the muslin for a long time. The days that followed Calder's arrest settled like dust over Baker Street, quiet, weighty and tinged with the stillness that comes after the final turn of a well-wound clock. Holmes moved about the sitting room with the energy of a man who had played every note of a sonata and now stood, waiting for the applause that never came. The case had concluded in the eyes of Scotland Yard. Calder was held pending formal charges. The newspapers had begun to stir with whispers of scandal in the Wayford household, though names had yet to surface in ink. But Holmes remained restless. On the third morning, I returned from an early round at my practice, to find him at the window again, the muslin still on the table beside his tea, folded once more into a perfect square. His violin sat untouched in the corner, and the day's newspaper lay unopened. He didn't look up as I entered. "Did you notice it, Watson?" I removed my coat. "Notice what?" "The ending." I frowned. "You mean Calder's confession? He hasn't made one." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair. "Exactly." He stood abruptly and crossed to the sideboard where he poured a single measure of whiskey, uncharacteristically early for him. Calder was many things: vain, calculating, cold. But he was also precise. Every move he made was layered, Watson. Each bluff concealed another. So why would a man like that remain silent? Because it benefits him? Because it hides something more? I sat down across from him. "Holmes, we have the brooch. We have Jacob's testimony. We have Malkin's note. What more do you suspect?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned instead toward the fire, swirling the whiskey in the glass without drinking. Agnes Finch left more than a trail. She left a question. He reached into the small drawer of his desk and withdrew the thimble, the brass one Nellie Dray had given him days earlier. He held it up, letting the light catch the engraved date once again. 15th October. She engraved this after the cellar incident, but not immediately. Look at the wear, it wasn't fresh. I leaned forward. "So you believe something else happened between the cellar and her death?" Holmes nodded. She heard Calder and Lady Wayford arguing. She found the brooch. She feared exposure, but she did not act in haste. She waited. She sowed a warning, not a declaration. She stitched silence, not accusation. He turned to me, eyes sharper now. She wasn't hiding what she knew from Calder. My voice came out quieter than I intended. She was hiding it from someone else. Holmes nodded once, and with that, we were back in the hansom by 10:30, cutting across the city under a pale winter sun. When we arrived at Wayford House once more, Lady Wayford met us in the library, composed but wary. The lines around her eyes had deepened. "Is this about the brooch again?" she asked. "No," Holmes said. "It's about the aftermath." She said nothing, but the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed her growing weariness. Holmes began to pace. Julian Calder was a man of strategy. He thought 5 steps ahead, and yet he made one mistake. He let Agnes go. If he feared what she heard, if he truly thought she might ruin him, he would have silenced her immediately. But he didn't. He waited, and someone else did not. Lady Wayford stiffened. "Are you suggesting—" "No," Holmes said gently. "I'm not suggesting you were involved. I'm suggesting you are not alone in protecting the family." There was a beat of silence. Then her voice, cold and low. "Malkin." Holmes shook his head. "Malkin tried to shield you. But he was not the only one with access to information. The house is a net, Lady Wayford. Every word spoken echoes through the walls. Every door closed opens another." Lady Wayford sat slowly. Her hands gripped the edge of the armrest, white-knuckled. "Who then? Who knew of the cellar conversation?" Holmes asked. Who saw Calder that day and remained silent? Who knew that Agnes had overheard something, and knew, perhaps better than Calder himself, what it meant? He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was the letter Nellie had received from Agnes 2 weeks before her death. Holmes had retrieved it that morning. He opened it carefully. "There's a line here, just one. Tell Bridie I'll bring her the rose pattern tomorrow. I frowned. The laundress? Holmes nodded. She and Agnes shared embroidery patterns, and it was Bridie who sorted the maid uniforms the morning after the fall. Lady Wayford's brow furrowed. Bridie has been with us for 5 years. She's loyal, Holmes finished. Yes, like Malkin. Like the rest of your household. But loyalty, as we've seen, takes many forms. Lady Wayford rose from her chair slowly. You believe Bridie found the brooch? I believe she found it that morning in the lining of the uniform. I believe she recognized its significance. And I believe, when she saw it gone hours later, taken by Jacob, she panicked. Lady Wayford's voice was faint now. You think she confronted Agnes? No, Holmes said. I think she confronted Malkin. And I think, together, they made a choice. We found Bridie in the laundry corridor, folding linens with mechanical precision. She looked up as we entered, her expression calm but flat. Holmes stepped forward and placed the thimble on the counter between them. Tell me, he said, when you found the pocket, did you realize what it meant? Bridie didn't move. The soft hiss of the steam pipe behind her was the only sound for a long time. At last, she said, I thought it was nothing. Then I saw the initials. Holmes watched her. So you went to Malkin? She nodded. I told him I'd burn the dress. He said it was too late, that the girl had already spoken to someone. And had she? Bridie hesitated. No, she said at last, but Malkin believed she would. Holmes exhaled. Then it was he who waited on the stairs. She shook her head slowly. Numbury went to her room. I watched from the pantry door, but she never answered. He waited outside. Then he left. Holmes stepped forward, his voice dropping. Who went after him? Bridie's eyes met his, and for the first time I saw what she had hidden behind her stillness, not fear, but grief. She did, Bridie whispered. Lady Wayford. A silence fell like a blade. I looked to Lady Wayford, who had followed us in. Her expression had gone rigid, the breath caught in her chest. Holmes turned slowly. She followed him? He asked. Bridie nodded. She asked what he'd said. He told her the brooch was missing, that Jacob had failed, that the girl might talk. Lady Wayford's voice returned at last, faint and cracked. I went to her room. I meant to speak with her. I meant to ask what she knew, but she wasn't there. I heard her on the stairs. She was coming down, and She closed her eyes. I told her to stop. She turned, she saw me, and she said, It's not yours. She meant the brooch, but it sounded like she meant the house. Like she'd decided. Her hands trembled. I didn't mean to touch her. I meant to stop her, but I stepped forward. She lost her footing. No one moved. I didn't speak. I didn't scream. I just stood there. And when she stopped falling, it was quiet again. Holmes stepped back. Bridie moved to Lady Wayford and placed a hand gently on her arm. It was the touch of someone who had known the truth all along and had borne the silence as a shared burden. And Holmes, my brilliant, tireless friend, said nothing. He simply looked at the muslin in his pocket and let it rest there, because Agnes Finch had stitched a warning, not a vengeance. And now the house had heard her. There was no formal confession, no theatrical collapse to the floor, no hysterics echoing down the corridor. Lady Wayford simply stood, frozen, her gaze fixed on the white linens Bridie had just folded with trembling hands. She did not look at Holmes. She did not weep. Instead, she did something far more terrible. She remained perfectly still. The kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the sudden absence of purpose. Holmes turned to her, and I could see in his face the battle between judgment and pity. His voice, when it came, was low and colorless. I do not believe you meant to kill her. She didn't answer. You meant to protect something, a name, a house, perhaps even a memory of your husband. But you misjudged her. She wasn't a threat. She was a girl frightened by the enormity of what she'd seen and unsure whether speaking it aloud would make her brave or doomed. Lady Wayford finally blinked. I only meant to stop her from speaking to Calder. I didn't know she had the brooch. I thought if I could persuade her, calm her, it would all pass. But it didn't, I said gently. Holmes turned away and began pacing slowly down the narrow aisle of the laundry corridor. The steam pipe hissed faintly, casting a breath of warmth against the otherwise cold stone walls. You told Bridie, or perhaps she knew without being told. Malkin guessed. Jacob stumbled into it without understanding what he was a part of. And Agnes, poor Agnes, believed if she simply left a trail behind, someone would find it before the truth swallowed her whole. Lady Wayford sank into the edge of the table, her shoulders beginning to fold inward. You will arrest me then? Holmes didn't answer at first. He stepped toward the door, then paused, his hand resting on the frame. It is not I who arrests, Lady Wayford. She looked up. It is the law, he continued, and in time it will come. But if you wish to meet it with dignity, I suggest you speak to Inspector Dallard directly. Tell him what you told me. Tell him the truth. I will, she said, her voice barely audible. Bridie bowed her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. Holmes turned to me then. Watson, we've done what we were asked. Let us go. We left Wayford House without further conversation. The cab was waiting where we'd left it, and as we climbed in, the driver flicked the reins with a grunt. The wheels turned smoothly over the wet stones, carrying us back toward Baker Street through the darkening fog. For some time, neither of us spoke. It wasn't until we crossed the river, Holmes's idea, for the long way home, that he broke the silence. I despise cases that end in silence. I looked over at him. Because there's no victory. No, he said softly. Because there's no restoration. The carriage turned along the embankment, the river glinting dully beside us. Holmes stared out, his breath fogging the glass. You saw how Agnes lived, how she moved through that house. She was invisible. And in death, she nearly remained so. Were it not for a scrap of muslin and a thimble, the world would never have remembered her. Name, I nodded. And yet, she spoke. Holmes glanced at me. Yes, and that is what redeems it. Not justice, not punishment, but voice. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson had laid out tea. We sat in silence for a time, Holmes in his usual chair, I in mine, both of us with our thoughts unspooling like threads in the firelight. Eventually I asked, Will Lady Wayford go to prison? I suspect not for long, Holmes said. She will confess, the court will weigh her grief against the circumstances, and perhaps it will decide that one death need not birth another. And Bridie? Complicity without malice. She will be questioned, no doubt. But she will say what she knows, and I believe she will be spared. What of Jacob? Holmes gave a tired smile. He will recover. He was a pawn in a game played too high above his head. But I dare say he will be wiser for it. I reached for the muslin scrap, still folded neatly on the edge of the side table. Holmes didn't stop me. It's strange, I said, how something so small could carry such weight. Holmes watched the cloth in my hand, his expression unreadable. She could have written everything out. She could have shouted it, but she chose to sew it shut, to seal the warning. She knew someone might open it, might not. She wanted it found, Holmes said, but only by someone who understood how to look. We sat a while longer. Then he leaned forward and picked up the thimble again, turning it over slowly between his long fingers. I wonder if she knew she was going to die. I didn't answer. The question was too heavy to lift. She wasn't naive, Holmes continued. She'd lived long enough in that house to know what silence protected, and yet she acted. He placed the thimble gently on the hearthstone. "That's the true mystery," he said. "Not the brooch, not the pantry, but courage. How it emerges from the most unexpected places, how the quietest voices sometimes ring the loudest." I refilled the teapot, though neither of us drank. "Do you think people will remember her?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "We will." And somehow that felt enough. Later that night I found Holmes still at his desk, writing. The fire had dimmed and the clock struck 2, but he hadn't moved. The muslin was beside him, the brooch and the thimble arranged as though part of a private reliquary. I said nothing, only watched him a moment longer before retiring. In the morning, when I came down, the muslin was gone, so was the thimble. But on the mantelpiece, under the corner of a paperweight, Holmes had left a folded card. On it, in his sharp, unmistakable script, was written just 6 words. She was not invisible to us. The rain came 3 days later, a steady, cold curtain that washed the soot from the rooftops and turned the streets of London into mirror pools of gaslight and shadow. I found Holmes once again at the window of our Baker Street sitting room, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his reflection pale and faint in the glass. Outside, the cabs moved slowly through the mist, and I could hear the distant clatter of hooves echoing off the stone facades. He turned as I entered, my overcoat dripping faintly at the shoulders, and gestured to the tea Mrs. Hudson had left. I poured 2 cups in silence before handing him one. The heat in the porcelain felt welcome, but it did little to ease the weight that still lingered in the room. An invisible pressure, like a volume not yet closed. "They've announced the hearing," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "Yes," he replied softly. "Lady Wayford has chosen not to contest it. She'll plead guilty. She already has. The charge is manslaughter, not murder. Her confession made that clear. There was no malice, only panic. And Bridie?" She gave a statement, honest, clear. "She will not be prosecuted. Scotland Yard has shown a rare measure of sense." I nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "And Calder?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "He will face charges for fraud, impersonation, and attempted extortion. He will likely serve his time and vanish again into some foreign venture. He is the sort who always lands upright, like a cat. But this time, his claws were dulled." We drank our tea in silence. It would have been easy, I suppose, to let it all end there, to allow justice to take its course, and for the matter to fade into the newspaper archives and drawing-room gossip. But Holmes, as ever, was unwilling to let a story conclude merely because it had reached its legal endpoint. "No one has asked the final question," he said suddenly. I looked up. What question? What would Agnes have done had she lived? I frowned. She was afraid. Perhaps she would have left. Perhaps she would have stayed silent. Holmes gave a slight shake of the head. Numbers she was gathering pieces. That thimble, the brooch, the muslin. Those were not random acts. They were evidence. Stitched, hidden, passed on. She may not have known how to speak, but she meant to be heard. "She did," I said gently. "Because of you." He smiled faintly. "Not because of me. Because of the voice that carried her warning. Nellie, Jacob, Bridie, even Malkin in his final gesture. Each of them carried a fragment. I merely arranged them. And now?" Holmes stood and walked to the mantel, where the card with his final words still rested beneath the glass weight. "She was not invisible to us. She died believing the truth might die with her," he said. "But it didn't. It passed through hands and eyes, and finally into words." I stood and joined him. "She'll be buried next week," I said. "Lady Wayford arranged it herself, quietly, with a small headstone in a country churchyard." Holmes looked down at the muslin which he had folded once more. Neat, plain, respectful. "She left no family." No blood. But Nellie will attend, and so will we. He nodded. Then let that be the last page. And so it was. The mystery of the maid who sewed a secret had begun with silence and shadows, but it ended, as so many of Holmes's cases did, not in triumph or punishment, but in a single human gesture, the choosing of truth over fear. And as we stepped once more into the London mist, our coats drawn tight and our footsteps fading into the fog, I could not help but think that some cases are not solved. They are heard, and that is sometimes enough. 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 Enough.